Hello, everyone. Good morning. We are so excited to have you with us today. My name is Becky Sullivan, and I'm the Director of K-12 English Language Arts here at the Sacramento County Office of Education and the project lead for the Literacy Coaches and Reading Specialists Educator Training Grant Program. Today, we're welcoming over 650 educators and colleagues to our Fall Literacy Professional Learning Network. This is just one of our offerings for California's system of support. We are here today because literacy leadership is a team sport and it takes all of us to make a difference. This event is hosted by the Sacramento and Napa County Offices of Education in partnership with the California Department of Education and Glean Education. We have an exciting day in store for everyone, with each of our presenters focused on language. To kick us off, we will begin with a welcome from the Napa County Office of Education's Superintendent of Schools, Josh Schultz.
Welcome to the fall convening of the California Literacy Professional Learning Network. I'm Josh Schultz, Napa County Superintendent of Schools. Today, I welcome you on behalf of the Literacy Coaches and Reading Specialists Educator Training Program, also called LCRSET. We here at the Napa County Office of Education, along with the grant leads at the Sacramento County Office of Education, are leading this effort by supporting 803 schools from 254 LEAs in the grant. This collaboration focuses on developing training and providing professional development for educators to become literacy coaches and reading specialists. It also provides support for the LEAs that receive the LCRS allocation. The LCRSET program supports the State Superintendent of Public Instruction's goal to have all California students reading by third grade. In addition to supporting the LCRS schools, SCOE and Napa COE are working collaboratively with the statewide system of support to increase statewide capacity in implementing effective literacy instruction. The Professional Learning Network is one way we are meeting that goal. Today, we have the honor of learning from three fantastic presenters who are all experts in their fields, all focused on different aspects of language and language instruction. Valencia Goodall from CORE, the Consortium on Reading Excellence, will present on language development and the connection to reading, considerations for MLLs. Dr. Julie Van Dyke from the Haskins Laboratory at Yale will give us an overview of the syntax and its critical role in comprehension. Dr. Tiffany Hogan, director of the SAIL Literacy Lab at the Mass General Brigham Institute of Health Professions, will give us an overview of language disorders. After the presentations, you'll have the opportunity to gather as regional hubs to debrief your learning. I hope you enjoy today's PLN, and I will see you on April 14th for our spring convening. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Josh. And now we can move forward to the next slide, please. Thank you so much. We are so excited to be here. I am Jessica Hammond, founder and CEO of Glean Education. We are thrilled to partner with the LCRSET Grant Initiative to coordinate this professional learning network event. For those of you who are not yet familiar with us, Glean Education partners with schools, districts, and states to deliver training, school leader consulting, and coaching. Our work aims to build educator knowledge of dyslexia and evidence-based literacy practices to improve student literacy outcomes. For this fall PLN, we welcome three nationally recognized experts in the field. Each speaker has made a significant impact through their contributions to literacy and language research. We are thrilled to welcome them as presenters for the PLN today. Each session will be recorded, and you'll be able to access the recordings on the LCRSET Grant Initiative Padlet linked in the chat. For our first speaker, I am thrilled to introduce Valencia Goodall. Valencia Goodall is a pioneering force in education, driven by a singular mission: to ensure that every student, regardless of their linguistic background, receives the literacy and language instruction they both need and deserve. As co-creator of OLA, Online Language and Literacy Academy, co-founder of Lingual Learning, and co-creator of Lexia English within Rosetta Stone Lexia Learning, her journey has been defined by innovation, impact, and unwavering dedication to empowering diverse learners. Today, she continues to shape the educational landscape as a leader in her role as Chief Strategy Officer at Core Learning. Maya's legacy is a testament to her extraordinary commitment to educational excellence. Please join me in welcoming Valencia Goodall.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you, SCOE and Napa County Office of Ed for inviting me and having me here today. So we are going to be talking about, let me move back one slide. Thank you. We are going to be talking about structured literacy and the multilingualism journey because we want to think about structured literacy through a wider lens, one that sees multilingualism not as a side note, but as a powerful central part of the literacy journey. This work isn't about teaching English instead of students' heritage languages. It's about teaching in ways that honor and extend the full linguistic repertoire students already bring. When we talk about structured literacy, we often think of the science of reading, and some argue that structured literacy and the science of reading aren't appropriate for multilingual learners. But we'll talk about today how the practices of structured literacy align beautifully with how multilingual learners acquire language and literacy. But we need to teach with intention. This is not a story of remediation or intervention. It's a story of opportunity, the opportunity to become bilingual. So, we're going to start today by redefining oral language, moving from teacher talk to student production. So we know that teacher talk dominates the classroom. We know for a long time when we said oral language, what we really meant was teacher talk. We modeled, we explained, we thought out loud, and students listened. But we now know that listening alone isn't enough. If students aren't talking, they're not learning, especially for multilingual learners. Producing language, actually saying the words, using the syntax, forming the ideas out loud, that is what builds comprehension. So, redefining what oral language means, shifting us from doing the talking to creating structured opportunities for students to do the talking. When students speak, they are rehearsing the same systems that reading draws on: phonology, syntax, and meaning. Our job is to make speaking part of instruction, to plan for it, to measure it, and celebrate it as literacy learning in action. These numbers always make me pause. Research shows that teachers talk about 70 to 80% of the time in most classrooms. That means that students are only talking 20% of the time or less. So think about what that means for language learning. If speaking is how we process, rehearse, and internalize language, then we're unintentionally limiting the very practice that students need most. When students are talking, they're building comprehension in real time. They're literally testing out vocabulary, testing out syntax and meaning. They're also hearing and saying phonemes, morphemes, and other parts of language. All of this is so important, especially when we get to teaching it in the text. So, our goal is simple: move from teacher centered language to student owned talk. So let's think about it. If language is not a spectator sport, we acquire language by using it, by speaking, by making mistakes and trying again. Let's think about how we could build our lessons around our students doing more talking. The students have to say the words, not just hear them, to activate the brain systems that connect sound, meaning, and print. Our job is to create classrooms where talk isn't a privilege, it's the pathway to learning. So we'll take a moment and have you drop in the chat. What are some ways that you would build in your own classrooms lessons around students doing the talking 60% or more of the time. Or if you're an instructional coach or you're a leader on campus, how would you encourage the educators in the classrooms to do this? The chat is open. You're encouraged to put ideas in there. Great. I see some ideas coming through. Think, pair, share, jigsaw activities, group or partner talks, encouraging collaborative group work, partner talk, give students choices when learning their lessons. Exactly. So we all have these ideas. We all understand student engagement strategies. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk more about those student engagement strategies that you're likely already using, and we're going to talk about how we connect that with structured literacy and build intentional, constructed sentences that the students can use to actually practice the parts and pieces of literacy. So let's get into it. Let's understand and talk about how speaking practice is the through line to comprehension. When we think about speaking as the through line to comprehension, it helps us to visualize how all of this fits together. Speaking isn't just an activity, it's the foundation that supports reading and writing. So, we created this visual to help us think of literacy as a house and spoken language as its foundation. Every skill that we build, phonemic awareness, decoding, vocabulary, comprehension, it rests on that foundation. If the foundation isn't strong, the rest of the house will wobble. But when we invest in oral language, having the students actually practice speaking, interactive, structured academic talk, we strengthen the whole entire structure. Speaking is how students build language. Reading is how they see it in action, and writing at the apex, that's what we have at the top, is the most challenging way to produce language. Every time students engage in meaningful conversation, they're not just practicing vocabulary, they're building a foundation to construct meaning. And most importantly, every student already comes with part of this house built: their heritage language, their linguistic knowledge, their way of using language to make sense of the world. Our job is to fortify the structure, not rebuild the house. When we look at the IDA's structured literacy info map, we see the blueprint for the House of Language and Literacy. So we have the house, this was the plan. So we can think of it as the architectural plan, the what and how of effective literacy instruction. The foundation is still language, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and discourse, everything that makes comprehension possible. Now, in the same way that a house needs both structure and life inside it, structured literacy provides the structure, explicit, systematic, cumulative teaching. But the life inside it, the structure that comes from speaking and interaction, that's what turns language knowledge into language use. So, when we say that speaking is the through line to comprehension, we mean that talking is not just an output of learning, but it's the mechanism that actually builds the comprehension. So, let's look at what's happening underneath that idea. Semantic loading: when students pronounce a word or even part of the word, they're activating their phonological processor. They're linking sounds to meaning. The act of saying the word strengthens memory and deepens understanding of it. Syntactic bootstrapping: when we give students structured speaking practice where they use specific grammatical or syntactic patterns, they begin to internalize those structures. That's what helps them parse complex sentences later when they read. Discourse knowledge. So using language frames to explain, compare, or argue allows students to practice the same organizational patterns they encounter in text. They're not only rehearsing vocabulary, they're rehearsing how meaning is built in language. They're rehearsing the construct of language. So remember, hearing that is very important to their ability to be able to create it. And then when they actually get to the text or create their own writing, they have a base with which to act. And then, of course, we have our cognitive strengthening. For multilingual learners, this process is especially powerful. So, when we are able to connect speaking languages and across languages, that enhances the executive function and flexible attention, skills that directly support comprehension. So, when students talk, they're not stepping away from reading instruction, they're building the systems that reading depends on. Speaking is rehearsal space for comprehension. So, one of the things that I've been hearing about traveling across the country is this idea of really wanting to bring together the ELA and the ELD playbook. How do the ELA teachers and the ELD teachers communicate and work together and understand that everything that they're doing is not two separate activities, but different sides of the same activity? So, let's think about ELD and ELA as one playbook. And we can think about how this alignment would actually look in action. So, the first thing to think about is that every literacy lesson would include planned student talk. Those would be tied to decoding and comprehension targets. We also think about that talk and text to mapping. So students first say words, they use grammatical structures out loud. They can either use vocabulary or they can use whole language frames. They can read those frames in connected text and finally write them. That sequence, speak, read, write, mirrors how the brain builds language systems. And then, of course, we want to have diagnostic talk checks. These are quick, intentional verbal check ins. Teachers have planned grammatical lessons, and then they go and listen to see if the students are actually absorbing and that the planned grammatical instructional lessons are taking hold. This is not about correcting. What we want to do is we want to listen so that we would know what we would do in terms of future instruction, right? So it's about tuning in to whether the grammatical focus of recent lessons is taking hold. It's deliberate, focused, and we're listening for evidence of learning. And finally, we want to take feedback with uptake. This is when we do give that feedback, it's specific and immediate. Students can repeat back in real time. So, when we want to give some feedback to the students, one of the things that we know from research is if we have the students repeat after us, it will take hold rather than just ourselves doing the repeating. So, sometimes we find ourselves doing a recast where we're repeating what the student has said, and it takes further hold if we have the student then repeat us with the correct grammar. It also gives us insight into what further instruction we would need to provide for the students. And finally, cross-linguistic bridges. So for multilingual learners and speakers of language varieties, we intentionally want to connect to what students already know. The sound systems, syntax, morphology from their first language or home language variety. That's what speeds transfer and strengthens the understanding. So when we talk about one playbook for ELA and ELD, this is it. purposeful, speaking, rich instruction that makes talk the bridge between word recognition and comprehension. Okay, so let's dive into it. Language frames. This is one way to get your students speaking with intention. When we look back again at the IDA structured literacy infographic, we see the core components of language: phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and discourse. So just give you a moment to take a look. Maybe you have to widen your screen a little bit to really look at the infographic and look under the what. This is where we are right now. So we notice that those same components, morphemes, graphemes, phonemes, syllables, stress patterns, all of those same components live in both speaking and reading. So language frames make that part visible and audible to the students. They take what we know about literacy as a system and turn it into something that students can do with their voices, something they can practice, refine, and own for themselves. When students use language frames to compare, explain, or argue, they're building the same structures they'll later encounter in text and then be able to write. They're rehearsing the syntax before reading it, shaping meaning before decoding it. So, just as print is a place where meaning is built through text, speech is a place where meaning is constructed through interaction. Structured literacy gives us the map, the content, and the methods of instruction. So, we look on the right hand side to the how. We see that we want to be explicit, sequential, systematic, and data driven. That is how we do it through the language frames. We create the scaffolds. We are explicit in our instruction. We understand what syntax we want the students to focus on, where they are. We use the language proficiency standards, the ELD standards, and the ELA standards to help us know what we're going to be teaching at any one time. And we also understand the how. So we put the what and the how together, and we're going to go more into it and discuss how to actually construct these. But the point that I'm making here is that it's built from this architecture of the what the students are saying, what they're practicing in terms of their syntax, what it is that we want the students to focus on, and then the how. So framing the language like this makes language visible. It's explicit instruction of the function and form, and it provides explicit speaking practice. Students are actually doing something with the language, and this is very important because this helps the students turn on their meta-linguistic function. We want them to be thinking about the language that they're creating, and the only time that they can be thinking about the language that they're creating is if they're actually creating the language, and then they're getting feedback from the person that they're speaking to. So when we frame the language this way and have our students practice it intentionally, we're turning on their meta-linguistic function, and they're able then to process the language, and they process it in the same place that they will be later processing text. So what are language frames? They are those scaffolded opportunities for students to practice syntax via speaking with each other. So when I say scaffolded, oftentimes people think of scaffolds as something to do very early in when students have, very little experience with English, or they're earlier in their experience with English. But when we think of scaffolded opportunities and we think about how language grows over time, like if we think about the third grader who is switching from learning to read and reading to learn, we understand that that language then becomes more depth and breadth of grammatical structures that are more complex. So we still want to scaffold speaking opportunities throughout all of the grades. And in fact, these speaking opportunities become even more important as the students are having that reciprocal nature of text. So when we're learning how to read, and then we are providing all of that language for the students to practice for their comprehension, and they're learning how to decode. And then once they have that skill, as they go into more advanced text, that actually then informs their language use, because the grammatical text structures become more complex. And so as we have our students practice those more complex grammatical structures out loud, it then informs their ability to understand and comprehend text. So it's a reciprocal nature. It goes back and forth. The scaffolds aren't meant to be removed completely and then we don't do language frames anymore. As we continue in our complexity of language, we can use the language frames in very specific and intentional ways. And that is because they are designed to be full and complete sentences. So, and I'm going to talk about that more and how we get that. But the teacher is then choosing the syntax focus based on the function and the form. So here's what language frames aren't. They're not sentence starters. Sentence starters are great for writing activities. They're also great as little bits of scaffold for students. But if we're really wanting to teach new grammatical structures, sentence starters don't give us enough information, don't give the students enough information to actually learn a new grammatical structure. Sentence language frames are also not driven by vocabulary, and they're not driven by the content. Vocabulary and content will be part of them, but the driver of a language frame is the syntax that the teacher is wanting to teach in that moment to help the learner move their language proficiency levels. The way that you're going to be able to move your language proficiency levels of your students is by teaching the grammar. One of the things that I see all the time in classrooms is that students, they're in what I call Groundhog Day. So they may have started in kindergarten, and then they're in first grade, and then they're in second grade, and they're testing at that early intermediate level over and over and over again. And so how we want to move the students is by focusing on the syntax and teaching full grammatical form. That will actually change their ability and how they're going to be moving through the language proficiency levels over time. Okay, so this is how we can actually create the language frames. You are invited. I think a link will be dropped in the chat if you want to use your phone and scan the QR code. Everything that I'm talking about will also be on a worksheet for you so that you can take this away and think about it. But the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to decide on possible language frames. So this is what we actually want to hear the students saying, the quote unquote answers. Like if you were to ask them a question, how would you want them to respond? What would be a full, complete sentence, an acceptable way for them to respond? You're going to think about that response and you're going to write it down. And then you would decide on a question. How could you propose a question to your students to get the desired response? So first you have to know what the response is, the target language, and the response and the language purposes. And then you could create your question. And then finally, you'll think about the scaffolding. What are the different experience levels that your students have with English, the language of instruction that I'm talking about now? Of course, you can use this same concept with other languages, any language actually, but for these purposes, I'm considering that the language of instruction would be English. So the first thing to do is to use the lesson objective. So you would look in any content, you could think about math, you could think about science, social studies, and of course your ELA content. And then you would create the entire sentences that you want to hear from the students. So you could write down how the sentences that you would want the students to hear, and you would think about their different language proficiency levels and what would be appropriate for, let's say, your very beginning students, your early intermediate students, and your more advanced students. So once you have your sentence, you think about how you can deconstruct it by taking the content words out. So let's think about it from this particular example, a third grade math lesson. This is a legit third grade math lesson that I picked up out of a third grade math book, looking at a particular lesson that was asking the students asking the teacher to have the students describe shapes based on their attributes. So they were talking about plane shapes, so flat shapes, and how they would describe them based on attributes. So the language function here is describe. So from that, you could go to your language proficiency standards. You could look at the ELA standards, and you could find different ideas on how you might construct a sentence around describing if you needed that help. In this day and age, you could probably put it into ChatGPT as well. And so the objective of this lesson, literally from the math book, was students will tell how to determine shapes based on their attributes. In this case, the attributes are the number of sides and number of angles. So this is coming from a third grade math book content. In the math book, the teacher was, according to the curriculum, the teacher was going to do all of this talking and or hand out worksheets for the students to then write in and tell the number of sides and number of angles. But from our perspective, and I mean our collective perspective on this call, on this webinar, we as language teachers and literacy teachers would understand that we actually want to build in language for our students to be able to practice these things out loud in full, complete sentences. Then we could later write about this, and then we could also later work in our math books, but we would have a deeper understanding and comprehension. And the reason why I chose a math lesson is because sometimes I think it's easier to see how to build in language in something that we're not doing. Let's say thinking about ELA and ELD, it's a place where we concentrate a lot of our language. So I wanted us to look away into math, and then we can think and look back again in ELA and ELD. Okay, so for this language frame, our response could be the shape is a triangle because it has 3 sides and 3 angles. That would be our whole entire sentence. So remember, our goal here, of course, we're in a math lesson and we do want them to be able to use the content, but we as language teachers are thinking about the grammatical structure of this language. So if we think about the language frame, it would look like this. The shape is a or an blank because it has, and then we know that we want to add in sides and then angles. So when we write it like this, it makes us think that this language frame is a content frame, but we started with the content, we started with the objective or the language objective, we started with the math objective. And then we wrote our whole entire sentence, and then we pulled out the content words. And the reason why we pull out the content words is because then what we're left with is the actual syntactical structure that's left. So besides the word shape, this sentence could be used over and over again to describe a lot of different things. We can change the word shape into other activities where the students could be talking about, let's say, amphibians. They could be talking about describing narrative. They could be talking about describing lots of different things. So that's what's important about the language frame, is that the syntactical structure is there, and then we can reuse different content words or vocabulary words in those spaces. So if we take that language frame from level 3, the you could see the bolded one. That would be like that early intermediate level. We can break it down in by language proficiency levels. We can see, for example, language proficiency level 1. We might break apart the sentence and have 2 or 3 simple sentences. We might start with the shape is, and then here we might be focusing on a and an and making sure that the students understand those articles. And then we could have it has blank sides, and then it has blank angles. That's a very simple way to describe the shape. And then if we were going to advance it to language proficiency level 2, we could do one simple sentence, the shape is a or an blank. And then we could have a complex sentence with the conjunction and. It has blank and blank. So we can see how we can build the language and scaffold depending on the language proficiency of the learner. The other important thing to think about with these language frame responses is when we have our students in the student engagement strategies, all of those wonderful things that you put in the chat. So we can think about our students in terms of their experience with the language. So for example, I might decide to have two students who are at the same language proficiency level work together in that pair. It's very important to have students have that think time, to have that opportunity to make a mistake, to try to shape those words and practice with someone at their language proficiency level. And then I might think about moving students around the classroom and having them do it again with someone who's at a different language proficiency level than they are. So we have this opportunity through the language frames to have these different conversations with people who have different language experience. I'm going to talk about the question and how to form the question next. So when we think about the questions, we think about the target language frame and the answer. So we know what we have in terms of the answer. And then we think about what question is going to evoke that target answer. So we use a sentence structure that will bring out the target grammar usage in the language frame. The important thing here is we also give the language frame to our students to use. So that means oftentimes when I see in classrooms, think, pair, share, it's framed around this concept of the teacher is asking a question at the front of the room, turn to your partner and tell them what you know about the blue whale, let's say. So instead, with the language frames, what we want to do is we want to have the students have the opportunity to use the question with one another. Asking and answering questions is very important with the language frames. That is how we give the conversation, the opportunity for conversation to the students. That is how we have them practice using their full linguistic repertoire. Sometimes the students, they might want to ask and answer the question in their heritage language first. There's a lot of research that suggests if we access our home language first and then practice in the target language, in the language of instruction, we have accessed that spoken language foundation from the house of language and literacy, and then we can bridge it to the next language. So having your students work in different pairs and using different linguistic foundations is helpful with the language frames. So what I want to do now is I want for you to think about the language frame questions. In this case, for our language proficiency level 1, we have what is this? Or we could just have describe. And that would be very simple, very accessible language for someone who has limited experience with English. If we want to think about how we would use this for language proficiency level 2, we could say, describe this shape or describe these shapes. And then language proficiency levels 3 all the way up, we could say, describe the attributes of this shape. That is actually the language from the math book and using the word attribute. But depending on where the students are in their language proficiency levels, we're going to scaffold the language so they can access it. Okay, so actually, I'm going to stay back here for just a second. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite you to think about a sentence, maybe create a question and a sentence and some scaffolded sentences and put them in the chat. So I'm going to go back again to this slide and have you think about how you might create some of your own language frames just right now. I know that everybody on this webinar has deep knowledge of syntax. You all have deep knowledge of how language works. And so just thinking and putting in the chat some samples of language frames that you could create maybe tomorrow for your students in class, something that you're working on right now in terms of an ELA lesson or a math lesson, a science or social studies lesson, and how you might create a question and the answers and how you might scaffold those language frames. So I'll give you a few moments to take those in and have those come through. I see some coming through. And then if you see a language frame coming through, then maybe you can try and test that language frame and see if you can fill it in and it works for you immediately. So for example, I see one here. A blank is similar to a blank because they both blank. Can someone else in the chat pick that language frame up and see if it actually works for you to talk about something that you want to do a comparing? So I see some other language frames coming through. I see some language sentence starters coming through. So remember, a language frame has a full, complete syntax. So we have the whole entire sentence is provided for the students, and it's just some content words that we might be filling in. So we want to make sure that all of it is there. So I see here one, my favorite blank is blank because blank. Full complete sentence from the beginning to the end. Okay, I see some, okay, we solved blank by blank. Great thinking. So see if you can go through and you can fill in someone else's language frame. So show us the frame, pick up a frame, and then fill it in your full chat. And some people are saying they can't see the language frames coming through.
I think we might be able to copy them and send them out to everyone. We'll do that.
Okay,
And,
fun. Well, just to be able to have some of this time to play with the language frames while we're together on the webinar.
somebody requested you that if you could go back to the example on the slide.
Yes, I can go back to the example. Well, there's this one. So let's think about how, the form and function. We decide on the question and then we choose the scaffolding. And then here is the example one, I think that was being asked for. So now if you've written one language frame, how might you take that same language frame and scaffold it? How might you make it more complex if it was a simple language frame? And then how might you take it and make it more earlier proficiency level if it was already complex. So think about your same language frame that you created the first time and see if you can make it more complex or less complex. And then see, like I said, if you can fill in somebody else's language frame. And I think I saw one earlier. Something about tacos went by, and I'm hungry right now, so it resonated. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, and a little note to everybody. If you're not seeing all of the chat, you can change the way you're posting from host to panelists to everyone, and that will help everyone see the chat. Okay. I'm looking for the filled in. All right, let's go back to the filled in. Everybody start filling in. Pick up somebody else's language frame, not your own. Don't fill in your own language frame. Pick up somebody else's language frame and fill in someone else's. That will let you know if those language frames are universal enough. And then we have a question. Where do we drop our answers? I can't see anyone's. I'm posting in everyone. Oh, we got that. Okay. Okay, thank you. I like coffee because it makes me happy. Love it. In the story, Goldilocks is one of the characters. The three bears are also additional characters in the story. Okay. I see a lot of Goldilocks. Although avocados and peaches are the same because they have a pit, they are also different because you can eat the peach skin, but you cannot eat the avocado skin. Okay, I see this one. An example of happiness is going to the beach because it connects me to nature. So an example of blank is blank because blank. That was that language frame there. The English word chocolate is similar to the Spanish word chocolate because they are both spelled the same and mean the same thing. Nice. Okay, and so have you had a chance now to think about your language frames and how you might make them more complex or make them more simplified depending on the language proficiency level of the students and how you would want to scaffold for them? Now, when I asked you that question earlier about ways that you could get more talk into your classrooms, a lot of you were talking about student engagement strategies. Thinking about the language frames and how you can apply them to all your content areas. Share in the chat ways that you can connect these two student engagement strategies to language frames and how that might make it different. That's one question. I'll let you answer that, and then I have another question for you. So how would you take your student engagement strategies and the language frames and it would be different? So your student engagement strategies, your think, pair, share might look different because you're actually going to be using the language frames with your students instead of just having them come up and try to create their own language without any scaffolding. So one of the things that I hear often is my students, I'm either A, they don't know what to say. So I put them in a think, pair, share. I put them in groups, and one student isn't talking and the other students are, or they don't know what to say. They don't know how to create or construct the whole entire sentence. So now if we think about those student engagement strategies, we have scaffold with their language frames. Now it's a different experience for the students. The other thing is thinking about our students and how we're actually grouping them. So if we're grouping them in homogeneous groups, if we're grouping them in heterogeneous groups, and why. So depending on what the instruction is at the moment, depending on how much experience the student has with the instruction at the moment, will determine if they're going to be in homogeneous groups or heterogeneous groups. The other thing with your heterogeneous groups, if let's say you have 3 or 4 students who are together in one group, and you know that there are students that have less experience with the language and students who have more experience with the language, then you are going to want to organize that group in such a way that perhaps you give them numbers or you give them colors, and you know that the students who have more experience with the language are going to be speaking first. And then let's say the student who has the next most experience with the language will speak next, and the students with the least amount of language will speak last. That will give them 2 opportunities to hear that language frame, the question and the answer, before it is their turn to create it. The other thing that you want to do is you want to train your students, the pairs and the shares, to be to know that when you're creating sentences in a new language, there is a moment of think time. So you want to train the students to allow their partners to have the think time that is necessary. The next thing that you can do is you can train your students to parse the language. So for example, if the student who has more experience with language, they are saying this shape is a triangle because it has 3 sides and 3 angles. And now the student who has less experience, they might start with the shape is because you understand that their metalinguistic function is turned on. That's why they're speaking slowly, because they're thinking about the language, they're thinking about the sentence, they're thinking about the order of the words in the sentence. So you want to train their pair to be patient, to wait. And then if that student is like, okay, I need the next word, I don't know what it is, then you train your students to give one word at a time scaffold. So triangle might be the next word. And you could train the pairs and the shares to do this. Then when you go in, as I talked about it earlier, when you go in for listening to the students, you know what you're listening for, you know what grammar you're listening to, and you're taking anecdotal notes. And then that's going to give you opportunity for further instruction if necessary. It will also give you an opportunity to give that feedback right then so that you can fine tune the grammar that you're expecting the students to be using in that moment. So every opportunity for language is an opportunity, every opportunity for instruction is a language teaching opportunity. One of the things about giving feedback to students that I talk about all the time is if your student is, let's say, doing 2 + 2 and they say equals 5, you wouldn't walk away from that and say, oh, you were so close, but I knew what you meant. You would absolutely say, okay, let's try that again. And you would just try to discern and discover, where did the little gap of understanding happen? You might give that student some manipulatives to count and actually touch and be able to count. But what you're doing is you're not going to just walk away and say, like, I knew what you meant. You were so close. That's good enough for now. Especially when we're listening for and creating these structures, we want to make sure that the students are using them exactly right. Okay, so thank you everybody for your participation with the language frames, with the creating the language frames, with the question and the answer. And now we can open it up to more further questions that anybody may have.
Thank you so much, Maya, for that amazing presentation. If you can forward over to the survey.
Yes.
That's great. So for our attendees, you can just move back to the survey. That's perfect. For our attendees, if you would complete the survey, and we do have some time for questions, about 15 minutes actually. So it's great to have that opportunity. Please do put your questions in the Q&A. We'll be watching it. If they do go in the chat, we'll be watching those too. And we do have some questions to kick us off and get started. So one of the first questions that came in the chat, and it was answered by Becky, but I think it would be a great idea to elevate it as well, because it's specifically related to the framing that you were working through. Can you share how language frames are different from sentence frames?
So in my experience, sentence frames are not based on full, complete sentences, and they might not be drawn directly from the content area that you're teaching. So you start first from what it is that you want to be teaching in that moment, and then you build out your language frame, and you are thinking about the syntax, what it is that you want the form and the function of that language frame to do. And then you want to use that language frame over and over again so that the students have the opportunity to practice that frame. The other thing with a language frame, and specifically, we call it specifically a language frame because they are meant to be spoken out loud. A sentence frame is not always spoken out loud. Oftentimes, they're used to scaffold for writing, which is a wonderful thing to do. But a language frame is designed for the students to be used out loud in spoken language. I hope that helps to kind of understand the difference between the two.
I think that's very helpful. Thank you for elevating that, Maya. So a question that came through in the chat was related to some shifts that are recently happening in California. The question had to do with the updated curricular adoptions that may be happening. The question said, what should school leaders be looking for related to language in their perhaps old curriculum or their newly adopted curriculums to make sure that they're addressing language related to supporting their English learners?
That's a really great question. And I think that what is probably going to be needed with the HQIM is the understanding of how to apply the structured literacy components to any HQIM. So it's first of all of this happens with the human beings first, right? So how what the teachers understand, how they are imparting that knowledge with the students in class and the instruction. So it's not about programs, it's about people. So that's first and foremost. The second is HQIM, so it's really about the people and the understanding. So understanding the components of structured literacy and how to apply those to any of the HQIMs. It's really bridging that. There's no one HQIM that's going to have everything, but if the teachers understand the components of structured literacy and they understand the components of language and literacy and how they work together, then they're going to apply that knowledge to their adopted materials and make those materials, really come to life in a different way. So it's really about understanding the bridges back and forth between those two things.
Excellent. Okay, another question that came in the chat is related to supporting coaches, as this is a coaching grant. What suggestions would you have for coaches who are supporting teachers to integrate language and literacy instruction into their current practice?
Well, CORE is a professional development group. That's what we do. And so we work directly with teachers, teaching language and literacy and how they work together. We work directly with coaches. And when we're working with coaches, I mean, of course, and I think I'm not going to say anything that you don't already know, but the goal is to understand what is the goal? What are you looking at in this moment? And prioritizing what it is that you're wanting to change or see differently and start with your prioritization list, of course, looking at data, looking at the actions or, the ways that instruction is taking place. So really working with your team to understand what are your goals and then starting from there. In terms of language, it is really about training your teachers to understand how to create more language in class. It's training the teachers on, and also it is training the leadership on understanding what to look for in terms of language in class. There has been time when, oral language was created by the teacher, and, as long as the teacher was doing a lot of talking, creating a language rich environment, that is what everybody was looking for. What we want to be looking for now is that the students are actually creating the language. So when you walk into a classroom, who is doing the talking? It should be the students. The students should be engaged in lots and lots of speaking practice every time we're walking in. So the coach's job is to coach the teachers. Like, if you really think about it, how are you going to get 60% of a instructional time that the students are actually speaking? That's a really big shift. It's a paradigm shift, thinking about a lot of the language is coming from the students. So how would you devise your lessons? How would you have it so that the students are actually producing that much language all day long? Imagine if they are. Imagine what will happen with their speaking ability, of course, with their language learning, of course, but then understanding that all of that is going to give you a very great return on your time investment in terms of reading comprehension and writing. So how do we make that happen? How does that shift happen in class?
Excellent. A question came through asking if this is appropriate for all grade bands and what might a teacher do to tailor this to pre-K or kindergarten?
Yes, absolutely. It's appropriate for all grade bands. I think in terms of kindergarten and preschool, that is where we see the most opportunity for students to do speaking practice. Part of it is because we know if the students are talking, they're also engaged, right? So there's a lot that happens in preschool and kindergarten in terms of singing, repetitions, in terms of creating, the total physical response, and of course, introducing, and having the students speak in complete sentences all the time. I would say that likely in kindergarten and preschool, you're already doing a lot of these activities. Really, where we can also think about it is in the upper grades and in adolescent. Lots of times when we're in middle school or, fifth and sixth grade, the students are not doing as much talking in those grades as they're doing in the preschool and kindergarten. So the through line, speaking is the through line to comprehension, and that happens through all the grade levels. So it's really, yes, thank you for asking that question. It is about thinking about it in the entire, span of the student's life, all the way from kindergarten through 12th grade. And ourselves, I mean, we do a lot of talking at work, ourselves as educators, right? So it's really understanding that connection. This is how we learn things. So thank you for uplifting that. And I appreciate the focus on pre-K and kindergarten. And it's likely that the students are doing a lot of talking. So I see a question here. Can you explain a little more about 60% of the time students should be doing the talking? So if you're thinking about yourself as very clean and clear and knowing exactly what you're doing in instruction, like what your purpose is, how much of the instruction you need to be there in a back and forth experience with the students, then you can understand that in the traditional classroom that I see right now, and that, many of us engage in, the teacher is doing the majority of the talking for the entirety of the lesson. Like if you go and you time yourself, it's very likely that you're doing the talking 60% of the time, and maybe the student has if they're lucky 40%, it's usually about 20%. We know this from research from, across the nation. So what we want to do is we want to flip that, because we understand that language learning happens when students are actually speaking. We understand that general learning in terms of learning anything happens when we're actually talking. Now, eventually that talk turns to internal talk, and we are thinking through language all the time. That is for sure. But right now, the person that's doing the most talking in class is the teacher. So the idea is to flip it. How can I be very, very intentional with my instruction? What do I actually need to teach specifically so that the student can perform what it is that I'm asking them to do? So can I parse that out in smaller bits so that I am teaching a part, the student is actually speaking, performing, doing something, then I take back some time, I'm teaching a little bit more, then the student is performing, doing, talking, doing something until I can extend where the students are the one that are actually showing that they're learning the concept that I'm trying to teach. So it's being very intentional about the time, what it is you're saying, why you're saying it, and how long you're going to take to be able to say it. So here's the thing, even with the language frame, if I have a simple language frame like this is a pen, I have seen teachers who will say the point of that is to teach the language frame, this is a, right? That's a simple language frame. It's a very important language frame because we can add onto it immediately. We can then say this is an, and we can start to distinguish the difference of why you would use a and an. So in this case, I'm teaching this is a pen, this is a notepad. See if you can see it. This is a cap, things that I happen to have here, right, on my desk. But I have seen teachers say this is a pen. This is the tip of the pen. This is the end of the pen. This is the shaft of the pen. They're talking and talking and talking about this pen rather than allowing the student to talk about the pen immediately, right? So this is a pen. Let's talk about the pen. Like, have the student talk about it. If you want to then say this is the tip, then it's the student then's talking about the tip. If we want to show the parts of the pen, that's a great thing to do, but it's really about making sure that at every moment, at every pass, the student has the opportunity to be creating language. I hope that
Very
helps.
good. Very good. Are there certain diagnostic assessments that you would recommend to assess language? There was a question in the chat that asked about uh, finding out where their students are on the oral language progression.
Yes, that's a great question. And, right now we are using a one time of year test to kind of understand, where a student is in their progression over the language frames. So we don't actually have that I have seen an amazing diagnostic that we can use during the year. So we can, parcel together things, but I think the most important thing is to listen, to take that anecdotal approach to the assessment for your students and actually listen to what it is that they're saying, how they're constructing sentences based on the instruction that you've given so that you can extract information and then understand what instruction needs to follow. So, it's really about us listening to them and understanding the language proficiency levels and where they might be and what instruction we have to insert there.
Mhm. That makes good sense. What is your suggestion for students who lack the vocabulary knowledge to fill in those language frames? How do you suggest scaffolding that vocabulary piece?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. I mean, the language frames can absolutely help you with the scaffold of the vocabulary. So you have the language frame and then you're actually inserting the vocabulary into it. You do all of your vocabulary teaching techniques and then actually have them use them in the language frame. So it's just really connecting the two things together. So if they don't know what a triangle is, you're explaining what a triangle is, you're showing them what a triangle is, and then you're immediately giving them a sentence where they can use that word in a complete sentence. So that connection to be able to use the vocabulary word in a complete sentence is, really mapping the linguistic mapping to the brain to the text immediately. So that's great. It's just a matter of putting them together.
That's excellent. And I just want to elevate in the chat that someone shared there is a oral language acquisition inventory that is used in a district. And I don't know if you have thoughts on that one, Maya.
I don't have thoughts on that. That's great.
Okay.
I'm really happy to hear about it. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. And then in closing, in our last minute here, do you have any resources that you'd recommend teachers, school leaders, coaches that have heard your presentation and are interested in more on this very topic?
Yeah, so we have our online language and literacy academy. It's called OLA, Online Language and Literacy Academy, where it's 9 modules, about 18 weeks, where we bring together second language acquisition, applied linguistic knowledge that we talked about in the structured literacy, and we put it together with reading instruction. So you don't have to choose between how do I do the language, how do I do the reading. We tie it all together for you in our online language and literacy academy. And I see it was just dropped into the chat. Thank you so much. And of course, we also have in-person coaching, on-site implementation support. So any of that HQIM, how to connect the dots between the HQIM, and then we have our leadership training as well. So we are a professional development house, and we can talk with you and your district and your teachers, your leadership, and help you wherever you are. We can provide that assist.
Well, Maya, thank you so much for your presentation today. And we are going to send our participants out to a 10-minute break. We'll be returning at 9:20 to a presentation with Dr. Julie Van Dyke on the missing link in reading comprehension syntax. See you all soon.
Thank you.